In the macabre mystery of the twins that not even science can explain, there are truths that the earth refuses to swallow. In 1928, a demolition crew working in the desolate wetlands of Yazoo County, Mississippi, uncovered a structural anomaly in the foundation of the ruined Rowan plantation house. It was not a hidden treasure, nor was it a simple architectural quirk, but a frantic, desperate concealment. Wedged behind the rotting timber of what had been the master bedroom's fireplace lay a water-damaged King James Bible, its leather cover fused with the damp clay of the riverbank. Inside, pressed between the pages of Genesis and Exodus, were loose sheets of coarse parchment covered in charcoal script, a terrified testimony that contradicted every official birth record of the county from 1852. The official census of that year states that Annabeth Rowan gave birth to a single male heir, Julian. But the charcoal scrawls, written by the trembling hand of an enslaved man named Caleb, tell a story so terrifying that even the doctors of the time wanted to forget it. They speak of a stormy night, a dual birth, and a mother's cold, silent order to remove the darker twin before her husband returned. This is not merely a story of a child who disappeared without a trace. It is the account of a crime where the victim was buried alive, yet never truly stopped living. What really happened at the Rowan plantation involves a darkness that goes deeper than the soil, revealing a family secret that chained the living to the dead in a bond that defied the laws of nature. Before we descend into the damp earth of Yazoo County to uncover this forgotten horror, I need you to make a choice. If you believe that history holds darker truths than what is written in school books, and if you want to be part of the community that brings these buried secrets to light, subscribe to Before the Story right now. Enable notifications because the algorithm buries these videos just like the secrets they reveal. Like this video to help us preserve this record. And tell me in the comments, what city or state are you watching from? I want to know where the witnesses to this history are gathering tonight. The documentary evidence for this case begins not with a birth, but with a demolition. When the wrecking ball struck the final chimney of the Rowan estate in the spring of 1928, the property had long been abandoned, surrendered to the creeping kudzu and the relentless rising tides of the Yazoo River. The demolition foreman, a man named Arthur Graves, noted in his logbook that the house seemed to resist falling, describing the timber as being unusually heavy, as if the wood itself had been soaked in something denser than water. It was Graves who found the Bible hidden in the masonry, a discovery that would have been discarded as trash had the loose pages not spilled out onto the muddy ground, revealing a frantic, jagged handwriting that bore no resemblance to the elegant cursive of the plantation owners. The setting of this tragedy is crucial to understanding the horror that unfolded. Yazoo County in the 1850s was a landscape defined by its soil, the infamous Yazoo clay. Geologists describe this earth as expansive, a volatile substance that swells violently when wet and shrinks when dry, capable of cracking foundations and moving entire structures inches at a time. It is a land that is constantly shifting, a geological environment where nothing stays exactly where it is put. For the superstitious, it was land that breathed. For the pragmatic planter, it was a constant battle against the elements. For Caleb, the author of the charcoal pages, this clay was the accomplice to a crime that would haunt the region for generations. The loose pages found in the Bible were not written all at once. Forensic analysis of the charcoal degradation suggests they were composed over a period of 7 years, from 1852 to 1859. The author, Caleb, was listed in the plantation's property ledger as a house servant age 34, valued at $800. Unlike the field hands, Caleb lived in the shadow of the main house, privy to the intimate silences and whispered conflicts of the Rowan family. His literacy, likely hidden from his masters and illegal at the time, allowed him to document the disintegration of a family that projected an image of perfect Southern aristocracy while rotting from the inside out. The primary figures in this tragedy were Silas and Annabeth Rowan. Silas was a man of his time, a proud, violent planter whose reputation for cruelty was well known in the county. Court records from 1850 show he was fined twice for excessive correction of his human property, a euphemism for brutality that bordered on lethal. He was a man obsessed with legacy, lineage, and the purity of his bloodline. Annabeth, his wife, was a woman of delicate constitution but iron will, described in society columns as a Natchez beauty. However, Caleb's account paints a different picture. A woman terrified of her husband's temper, living in a gilded cage where her primary duty was to produce an heir that reflected Silas's vanity. The document that initiates this investigation is the first page found in the Bible, dated November 14, 1852. It does not begin with a prayer, but with a confession of complicity. "The earth here is too heavy to hold a secret," Caleb wrote, "yet she made me dig." This line sets the tone for the entire narrative. It establishes that what is about to happen was not an accident, but a deliberate act of concealment. The she refers to Annabeth, and the digging refers to a task that no servant should ever have been commanded to perform. At the time of the event, the Rowan plantation was at its economic peak, yet the atmosphere was stifling. Correspondence between neighboring estates mentions a black mood settling over the Rowan house. The neighbors attributed it to the unseasonably warm November, which brought heavy storms and turned the roads to impassable slurry. But the truth was far more domestic and far more sinister. Silas Rowan was away on business in New Orleans, leaving Annabeth alone on the estate as her confinement reached its term. His absence was the catalyst that allowed the impossible to occur, creating a vacuum of authority where Annabeth would make a decision that defied both the law of man and the law of God. The psychological state of Annabeth Rowan in the weeks leading up to the birth is documented in her own personal letters to her sister in Virginia. In them, she expresses a profound anxiety, not about the dangers of childbirth, which were real enough, but about the nature of the child she carried. She wrote of dark dreams and a fear that the child would not favor the Rowans. These letters, read in retrospect, suggest a woman who was hiding a secret long before the labor pains began, a secret regarding the true parentage of the life growing inside her. Caleb's role as the chronicler is unique because he was both a victim and an instrument of the horror. He writes with a sense of resignation, a man who knows that his survival depends on his silence, yet his soul requires him to speak. He describes the heavy, humid air of that November night, the way the Spanish moss hung like tattered shrouds from the oak trees, and the ominous stillness of the river. The environment itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the violation of nature that was about to take place in the master bedroom. This exposition establishes the foundation of the mystery. We have the physical evidence of the crime, the Bible, and its hidden pages. We have the motive, fear of a violent patriarch and the concealment of a genetic truth, and we have the weapon, not a gun or a knife, but the suffocating, inescapable weight of the Yazoo clay. The stage is set for a birth that would become a burial, and for a silence that would scream through the decades. The sequence of events on the night of November 14th, 1852, begins with a deviation from standard medical practice. According to Caleb's account, the local midwife, a woman named Mrs. Gable, was summoned at dusk, but was dismissed by Annabeth Rowan shortly after midnight before the labor was fully concluded. The official explanation given to the plantation staff was that the birth was difficult and the mistress required absolute privacy. However, Caleb's notes reveal that Mrs. Gable left looking pale and shaken, clutching her bag as if fleeing a crime scene. She was paid triple her usual fee, a transaction recorded in the household ledger as medical services and discretion. Inside the master bedroom, the atmosphere was thick with a terrifying silence. Caleb, who had been ordered to bring basins of hot water and clean linens, stood in the corner, invisible in his servitude. He witnessed the birth of the first child, a boy who would be named Julian. The infant was small, pale, and cried lustily, his skin flushing pink in the candlelight. Annabeth held him for a moment, her expression one of relief, before handing him to the nursemaid, but the labor was not over. The pains returned, sharper and more violent, indicating the presence of a second child, a twin whose existence had been unsuspected. The birth of twins in the mid-19th century was often viewed with superstition, but what happened next had nothing to do with folklore and everything to do with the harsh realities of racial hierarchy in the antebellum South. When the second child emerged, the silence in the room became absolute. Caleb writes that the baby was healthy, kicking and gasping for air, but his appearance was undeniably different. His skin was noticeably darker, his hair possessing a texture that betrayed a lineage Silas Rowan would never claim. He was, in the brutal parlance of the time, proof of betrayal. Annabeth Rowan did not scream. She did not cry. According to the charcoal testimony, she simply turned her face to the wall. She refused to hold the second infant. She refused to look at him. The child lay on the bloodied sheets, wailing into the void of his mother's rejection. The nursemaid, an older enslaved woman named Sarah, looked from the child to the mistress with eyes wide with terror. She knew, as Caleb knew, that the existence of this child was a death sentence, not just for the infant, but potentially for everyone in the room who witnessed his arrival. The anomaly here is the complete absence of maternal instinct, replaced by a cold, preservationist panic. Annabeth sat up in bed, her face drained of color, and issued a command that froze the blood of those present. She did not order the child to be washed or swaddled. She pointed to the writhing infant and spoke a single word to Caleb: remove. It was a command usually reserved for soiled linens or waste, now applied to her own flesh and blood. She did not specify where he should be taken, only that he must be gone before morning. Caleb describes the weight of the moment as physical, a pressure pushing down on his chest. To refuse was to invite the wrath of the masters, punishable by torture or death. To obey was to commit a mortal sin. He approached the bed, his hands shaking. He wrapped the second child in a rough towel, distinct from the fine linen used for Julian. The baby, sensing the warmth of a body, quieted instantly, settling against the chest of the man who was being conscripted as his executioner. This moment of quiet trust is one of the most harrowing details in the entire document. The documentation of this night stands in stark contrast to the parish records. The baptismal registry at the local Episcopalian church lists only Julian Silas Rowan, born November 14, 1852. There is no mention of a twin. There is no death certificate for a second child. In the eyes of the law and the church, the dark twin never existed. He was erased the moment he drew breath, unmade by the societal laws that dictated who was a person and who was merely a problem to be solved. The nursemaid, Sarah, was ordered to clean the room and burn the bedding. Every trace of the second birth was to be incinerated. Caleb writes that Annabeth watched the fireplace with a glassy stare, ensuring that the blood-soaked evidence was turned to ash. The cruelty was not impulsive. It was methodical. She was calculating the time of her husband's return, the narrative she would spin, and the necessary silence she would enforce. The survival of her social standing depended on the complete obliteration of the second son. As Caleb stepped out onto the porch, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain lashed the plantation, turning the ground into a quagmire of mud. He held the bundle under his coat, shielding it from the elements, caught in a paralyzed moment of indecision. He stood between the warmth of the house and the darkness of the fields, holding a life that had been condemned by its own complexion. The anomaly of the night was complete. A mother who chose death over shame, and a slave forced to become the keeper of the family's darkest truth. The narrative Caleb constructs in the following pages is one of agonizing escalation. He did not immediately go to the river. He retreated to the tool shed, the child sleeping against his chest. He writes of a desperate hope that the mistress would change her mind, that grief would override fear. But when he looked back at the main house, he saw the lights in the master bedroom extinguished. The decision was final. The order was not to kill the child directly. Annabeth had been specific about avoiding the stain of blood, but to return him to the earth. Caleb found an old cypress box, originally used for storing nails and iron fittings. It was sturdy, resistant to rot, and horrifyingly small. He lined it with straw and a piece of burlap sack. He describes the sensation of placing the sleeping infant into this makeshift coffin as the moment his own soul began to fissure. The child was warm, alive, and breathing. The act was not a burial of the dead, but a sentencing of the living. He did not nail the lid shut. The swelling of the wood in the wet clay would seal it tight enough. The location chosen for this macabre task was a bend in the Yazoo River known locally as the Devil's Elbow. It was a place where the clay was particularly dense and the currents undercut the bank, often causing large sections of land to slide into the water. Caleb reasoned, perhaps with a sliver of mercy, that the river might eventually claim the box and carry it away, or that the depth of the mud would be quick. He walked a mile through the driving rain, his boots sinking deep into the slurry, the weight of the box growing heavier with every step. Upon reaching the riverbank, Caleb dug. The wet clay fought him, sucking at the shovel, heavy and clinging. He writes, "The earth did not want to open, as if it knew it was a sin." He dug a hole 3 feet deep, well above the current waterline, but deep enough to be hidden. He placed the box into the wet void. Before covering it, he placed his hand on the lid and whispered a prayer that he knew was insufficient. The sound of the first shovel load of wet clay hitting the wood is a detail he repeats 3 times in the text, a sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. In the days following the event, the accumulation of anomalies began to manifest within the household. The official story circulated was that the birth had been arduous but successful, resulting in a single healthy heir. Yet the servants noticed that Annabeth refused to sleep in the dark. She demanded candles be kept burning in the nursery at all hours. She would not be left alone with Julian, the surviving twin. Whenever the infant cried, Annabeth would freeze, listening intently, as if trying to distinguish his cry from another sound only she could hear. Caleb returned to his duties, a ghost moving through the house. He washed the mud from his clothes, but he could not wash the sensation of the box's weight from his arms. He noted that the other slaves sensed something was wrong. They avoided the Devil's Elbow, claiming the birds had stopped singing in that part of the woods. There was a collective, unspoken awareness that the balance of the plantation had shifted. The moral rot had set in, and the land itself seemed to react. Crops in the lower field failed that season, the roots rotting in the overly wet soil. Silas Rowan returned 2 weeks later, greeting his son Julian with pride and his wife with a cold possessiveness. He never asked about the labor details. He was satisfied with the result, a white male heir to carry his name. But Caleb observed that Silas's dogs, usually obedient hunting hounds, refused to go near the riverbank. They would whine and bristle at the edge of the woods, sensing the disturbance in the earth that their master was too arrogant to perceive. The most disturbing evidence from this period is Caleb's observation of Julian. Even as a newborn, the surviving twin exhibited strange behaviors. He would often hold his breath until he turned blue, mimicking suffocation. He slept with his fists clenched tight, as if fighting for space. The nursemaid Sarah whispered to Caleb that the baby slept heavy, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too slow, too labored, as if he were breathing for two. The accumulation of these small, terrifying details paints a picture of a haunting that began immediately. There were no spectral chains or transparent ghosts. The haunting was biological and geological. The buried child was not gone. He was simply displaced, his existence pressing against the conscience of the mother and the physiology of his brother. The clay of the Yazoo River had accepted the deposit, but it had not promised to keep it quiet. As the weeks turned into months, Caleb began to formulate a hypothesis in his writings, trying to make sense of the cruelty he had facilitated. He looked back to the spring of 1852, 9 months prior to the birth. He recalled that Annabeth had spent 3 weeks in Noxubee County, ostensibly visiting a sickly aunt. Silas had remained at the plantation, overseeing the planting. Caleb pieced together fragments of overheard conversations and the hushed gossip of the house staff. The trip to Noxubee had been unchaperoned for long stretches. The hypothesis Caleb commits to paper is that the darker twin was the result of a transgression during that trip. An affair, consensual or otherwise, with a man of color. This phenomenon, scientifically known as superfecundation, where twins have different fathers, is rare but possible. To the 19th century mind, however, it was a biblical curse, a physical manifestation of sin. The twins' complexion was the proof of betrayal that Annabeth had feared in her letters. It was irrefutable evidence that would have destroyed her marriage, her social standing, and likely her life had Silas seen it. This realization shifted Caleb's understanding of Annabeth. She was not merely a monster, she was a woman cornered by the violent patriarchy of her society. Her survival depended on the erasure of the evidence. This did not absolve her of the murder, but it gave it a terrifying logic. She had sacrificed one son to save the other and to save herself. The burial was a frantic attempt to hide her own history in the mud of the riverbank. Caleb also hypothesized about the connection between the twins. He noted that Julian was a fretful baby, prone to inexplicable bouts of distress that coincided with heavy rains. When the river rose and the ground at the Devil's Elbow became saturated, Julian would scream inconsolably. Caleb theorized that the twins shared a soul, split between two bodies. One was in the crib, wrapped in silk. The other was in the box, wrapped in burlap. When the earth pressed down on one, the other felt the weight. The document reveals Caleb's internal struggle with this knowledge. He possessed the power to destroy the Rowan family with a single word to Silas. Yet he knew that such a revelation would lead to a massacre. Silas would likely kill Annabeth, the surviving child Julian, and Caleb himself for knowing the truth. The hypothesis of the twins' origin became a chain that bound Caleb to Annabeth. They were co-conspirators in a silence that was growing heavier by the day. This section of the Bible pages also reflects on the nature of the sin. Caleb writes, "The master thinks he owns the blood, but the blood tells its own story." He recognized the irony that Silas Rowan, a man who built his wealth on the subjugation of black bodies, was raising a son who shared a womb with a black brother. The racial hypocrisy of the plantation system was encapsulated in that divided birth. One child elevated to princely status, the other discarded as refuse, solely based on the shade of their skin. Caleb's writings during this time become more theological. He questions why God would allow such a division. He wonders if the buried child is waiting for Judgment Day, or if he is already seeking justice. he begins to see signs in the landscape. A cypress tree near the burial site that died suddenly, its needles turning rust red. The way the river seemed to eddy and swirl at that specific bend, as if snagged on an obstruction that wasn't there. The hypothesis extended to the future. Caleb predicted that the secret could not stay buried. "What is sown in corruption," he quoted from the Bible he wrote in, "must be raised in incorruption." He feared the harvest that was coming. He understood that the violence of the burial was a seed planted in the fertile, angry clay of the Yazoo, and that eventually it would sprout something terrible. This block concludes with a chilling realization from Caleb. Annabeth knew it too. He caught her staring out the window toward the river, her hand absent-mindedly stroking her throat, as if she were feeling the sensation of choking. The mother and the slave shared a hypothesis that was becoming a reality. The dead twin was not resting. He was waiting. By 1855, the rot at the heart of the Rowan family began to manifest in the social fabric of the plantation. The documents record a sharp decline in the family's standing. Neighbors who once flocked to the estate for balls and dinners began to send regrets. The excuses were polite: illness, travel, business, but the pattern was undeniable. The Rowan house had developed a reputation for being unlucky and heavy. Guests complained of a stifling atmosphere, of sudden drops in temperature, and of a pervasive smell of wet earth that no amount of potpourri could mask. Silas Rowan, oblivious to the root cause, reacted to the isolation with increasing volatility. He blamed the slaves, the weather, the political climate. His violence, once calculated, became erratic. Caleb documents an incident where Silas beat a stable hand nearly to death because a horse stumbled. He screamed that there was disrespect hidden everywhere. He felt the judgment of the community and the unease of his household, but lacking the truth, he lashed out at shadows. The Yazoo malaise, as the locals called it, was centered squarely on his land. Annabeth withdrew completely from society. She stopped attending church, claiming that the hymns gave her migraines. In truth, Caleb writes, she could not bear the talk of resurrection and judgment. She spent her days in the nursery, watching Julian with a hawk-like intensity. She forbade him from playing outside, terrified that he would wander toward the river. She became gaunt, her beauty fading into a skeletal mask of anxiety. The silence between husband and wife grew into a chasm. They lived in the same house but inhabited different realities, his defined by anger, hers by terror. The house itself seemed to suffer from a structural fatigue. Caleb notes that the floorboards in the hallway groaned constantly, even when no one was walking on them. Doors that were latched would swing open. Cracks appeared in the plaster of the nursery walls, always running vertically like veins in the clay. Silas hired carpenters to shore up the foundations, complaining that the house was settling unevenly. The carpenters found nothing wrong with the beams, yet the sounds persisted. The creak of wood under invisible weight, the sound of settling earth. The enslaved community on the plantation, always the first to sense spiritual danger, created their own protective rituals. They hung bottles from trees to catch evil spirits and sprinkled brick dust across the thresholds of their cabins. They refused to eat food that came from the kitchen of the main house. Caleb writes that the elders spoke of a haint that was confused, a spirit that didn't know if it was child or man, looking for a way back inside. They knew a crime had been committed, even if they didn't know the specifics. Julian, now a toddler, became a focal point of this social fracture. He was a quiet, solemn child who rarely smiled. He had no playmates. When cousins visited, they cried and asked to go home, saying that Julian stared at them. The boy was isolated by his mother's paranoia and his father's harsh expectations. He became a strange, solitary figure. wandering the corridors of the settling house, listening to the walls as if waiting for a message. Caleb's role as the buffer between the masters and the reality of the situation became increasingly precarious. Silas began to suspect Caleb of sullenness, misinterpreting his burden of guilt for insubordination. Caleb lived in constant fear that Silas would turn his violent gaze toward him. He slept with the Bible under his head, the charcoal pages hidden within, capturing the disintegration of the world around him. He describes the sensation of the plantation as a holding breath, a tension that was stretching to the breaking point. The fracture extended to the economy of the farm. The cotton yields decreased. Overseers quit, citing the bad air of the place. The Rowan name, once a symbol of power in Yazoo County, began to be whispered as a cautionary tale. The community sensed that the land was cursed. They didn't know about the box in the riverbank, but they knew that the Rowan soil yielded only misery. This block ends with a specific, chilling observation. During a dinner party, one of the last attempted, a guest asked Annabeth how many children she hoped to have. Annabeth dropped her wine glass, which shattered on the floor. She stared at the red stain spreading on the carpet and whispered, "The earth has enough." The dinner ended in silence. It was the last time the Rowans entertained. The social fracture was complete. They were now alone with their secret. In 1856, when Julian was 4 years old, the anomalies shifted from atmospheric to physical. Until this point, the haunting could be dismissed as the product of a guilty conscience or superstition. But on the morning of May 12th, an event occurred that left verifiable proof. The nursemaid found Julian asleep not in his bed, but on the floorboards, curled into a fetal position. When she tried to wake him, she screamed. The boy's nightshirt was stained with wet red clay. His fingernails were packed with it. The immediate assumption was that the child had disobeyed orders and gone outside during the night. Silas was furious, threatening to whip the nursemaid for negligence. He interrogated Julian, demanding to know why he had left the house. But Julian, calm and detached, insisted he had not left his room. He held up his hands, looking at the dirt under his nails with curiosity rather than fear. "I was digging," he said simply. "He asked me to help him dig up." Caleb examined the room. The windows were latched from the inside. The door was locked. There were no muddy footprints leading from the exterior doors to the nursery. The clay was seemingly localized to the boy's body and bed linens. Furthermore, Caleb recognized the texture of the soil. It was not the topsoil of the garden. It was the dense, gray-blue clay of the deep riverbank, the clay of the devil's elbow. This event marked a turning point. It was physical evidence that the connection between the twins transcended physical space. The buried child was digging up, trying to breach the surface, and Julian, in his sleep, was digging down to meet him. The twin ship was acting as a bridge. The mud was manifesting through the spiritual bond, materializing in the safety of the bedroom. Annabeth's reaction was catastrophic. Confronted with the stained sheets, she collapsed. She ordered the linens burned, just as she had done with the birth sheets 4 years prior. She began to scrub Julian's hands, using a stiff brush until his skin was raw and bleeding, trying to remove the stain of the earth. She screamed at him to stop playing in the dirt, but her eyes betrayed her knowledge. She knew exactly whose dirt it was. Other incidents followed. Servants reported finding small puddles of river water in the hallway outside Julian's door, even during dry spells. The smell of the river, a distinct metallic scent of algae and wet stone, permeated the nursery. Julian began to speak in the plural. When asked if he was hungry, he would reply, "We are hungry." When asked if he was cold, he said, "We are cold." He was becoming a vessel for the brother who had no voice. Caleb documents his own terror in the face of this irrefutable evidence. He realized that the box he had buried was failing to contain its contents. The wall between the living and the dead was permeable for the twins. He writes, "The grave is not a lock, it is a door." He began to fear that Julian would eventually be pulled physically toward the river, or that the river would come for him. Silas, confronted with the sleepwalking and the dirt, brought in a physician, Dr. Aris Thorne. Silas demanded a medical explanation for the boy's filthy habits. He refused to see the supernatural implications, interpreting the events as a behavioral defect in his heir. This refusal to accept the evidence created a triangulation of conflict: Julian the vessel, Annabeth the conspirator, and Silas the denier. The impact of this evidence was the total destabilization of the household's reality. The servants began to leave in droves, accepting punishments rather than staying in the mud house. Caleb remained, anchored by his complicity. He watched as Julian grew thinner, seemingly feeding two metabolisms. The boy was exhausted, terrified of sleep, yet unable to resist the pull of the dreams where he met his brother in the dark, wet earth. The evidence was clear. The buried child was growing stronger, and he was dragging his brother down to join him. By 1857, the hierarchy of the Rowan plantation had disintegrated into madness. Annabeth's psychological deterioration accelerated into full-blown psychosis. She was no longer the cruel, calculating mistress of 1852. She was a woman, hunted by her own memory. Caleb records that she began ordering the house slaves to wash floors that were already pristine. She would drop to her knees, scrubbing the hardwood, screaming about muddy footprints that only she could see. These footprints, she claimed, were small, infant-sized, and they led from the front door directly to the nursery. The authority of the mistress collapsed when she began to accuse the servants of conspiring with the mud. She fired the cook for serving potatoes that tasted of the river. She struck a maid for looking at her with judgment. Her unraveling was public and terrifying. She wandered the halls at night carrying a candelabra, calling out for the other one, begging him to go back to sleep, promising that she hadn't meant to leave him in the cold. Silas's authority also crumbled, but differently. He could not control his wife, and he could not correct his son's behavior. His violence became impotent. He would roar orders that were ignored or made irrelevant by the supernatural chaos. He found Annabeth one night in the nursery, holding a pillow over Julian's face. She was weeping, whispering, "He won't stop scratching. I have to stop the scratching." Silas had to physically wrestle her away from the boy. It was the moment the family unit was irrevocably destroyed. Silas locked Annabeth in the guest bedroom, effectively imprisoning her. He told the staff she was suffering from nervous fever. But through the locked door, her screams echoed through the house. She wasn't confessing to adultery. She was confessing to the soil. "It wasn't me," she would scream. "The dirt told him. The dirt told him where to go." She had abdicated her agency, believing herself to be a victim of the land she had tried to use as an accomplice. With the mother imprisoned and the father paralyzed by confusion and rage, Julian was left largely unsupervised. He roamed the house like a specter. Caleb writes that the boy stopped speaking to the living almost entirely. He would sit for hours, staring at the floorboards, tapping a rhythm with his fingers. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the sound of digging, or the sound of escaping. The plantation was now ruled by the whims of a 4-year-old boy and the ghost attached to him. Caleb's authority as the keeper of the secret also began to fray. He considered fleeing, running north, but he felt anchored by the child. He saw Julian as the only innocent party in the tragedy. He began to leave extra food in Julian's room, knowing the boy was eating for two. He sat outside the nursery door at night, guarding the survivor from the madness of the mother and the wrath of the father. The slave had become the only functioning guardian in the house. The collapse extended to the physical plantation. The fields went fallow. The intricate garden Annabeth had prized was consumed by weeds. The fences rotted. The Rowan estate became a place of entropy. The authority of man over nature, which the plantation system relied upon, had been inverted. Nature, in the form of the river and the clay, was now dictating the terms of existence for the humans trapped in the house. This block culminates in a chilling scene recorded by Caleb. Silas, drunk and desperate, attempted to whip the madness out of the house. He took a riding crop to the walls, striking the plaster, shouting at the invisible force to show itself. He was a man fighting a ghost with a stick. He collapsed in the hallway, weeping, a patriarch broken by a sin he didn't even know the name of. Caleb watched from the shadows, recording the fall of the tyrant who had been defeated not by rebellion, but by the weight of a small buried box. The narrative deepens with the introduction of an external perspective. In the chaos of the collapsing household, a letter was preserved, written by Dr. Aris Thorne to a colleague in Vicksburg. Thorne had been summoned by Silas to treat Julian and Annabeth. This document, found years later in medical archives, provides a clinical yet horrified validation of Caleb's supernatural accounts. Thorne was a man of science, a skeptic, yet his letter reveals a profound disturbance in his rational worldview. Thorne describes his examination of Julian in 1858. He notes that the boy was physically healthy, but exhibited signs of dual consciousness. Thorne writes, "The boy speaks with a cadence that suggests a dialogue, though only one voice is audible. He answers questions before they are fully asked, as if receiving counsel from an unseen partner." Thorne diagnosed the child not with madness, but with plurality, a term that implies more than one soul inhabiting a single space. The most damning part of Thorne's letter describes a physical examination. He found marks on Julian's chest and arms, bruises that looked like the imprint of small fingers, grasping from the inside or pressing with impossible force from the outside. The bruises were consistent with the size of a newborn's hand, yet Julian was now 5 years old. Thorne notes, "It is as if the child is being embraced by a shadow that refused to grow." Thorne also interviewed Annabeth through the locked door of her room. He records her ravings not as nonsense, but as a fractured confession. She told him about the box. She told him about the devil's elbow. Thorne, thinking this was a metaphor for hell, missed the geographical clue. However, he advised Silas Rowan in the strongest possible terms to remove the boy from the plantation. "The air here is thick with a miasma that is poisoning the child's mind," Thorne wrote. "He must be taken across the river, away from this soil." Silas refused. His pride would not allow him to flee his own land. He dismissed Thorne, calling him a quack. But Thorne's letter serves as the hidden source that confirms the reality of the situation was visible even to outsiders. It proves that the haunting was not a collective hallucination of the family and their slaves, but an observable phenomenon with physical symptoms. Caleb mentions Thorne's visit in his Bible pages. He writes that he saw the doctor standing on the porch, staring at his hands, wiping them repeatedly as if they felt dirty. Caleb knew that Thorne had felt the cold spots in the nursery, the unnatural drop in temperature that signaled the presence of the other twin. Thorne's departure was a flight. He left his medical bag behind, too terrified to go back into the house to retrieve it. The discovery of this source recontextualizes the tragedy. It shows that there was an opportunity for salvation. Had Silas listened to the man of science, had he taken Julian away from the Yazoo clay, perhaps the bond could have been broken. But the refusal to act sealed their fate. The hidden source is a testament to the willful blindness of authority in the face of uncomfortable truths. Thorne's letter ends with a postscript that is chilling in its foresight. "I fear," he wrote, "that nature will correct the imbalance in that house. What has been separated by violence seeks to be rejoined. If they do not release the boy, the earth will come for him." It was a diagnosis that read like a prophecy. The climax of the documentation arrives on November 14th, 1859, the twins' 7th birthday. The weather mirrored the night of their birth. A catastrophic storm hammered Yazoo County. The river, already swollen from autumn rains, breached its banks. The Devil's Elbow was eroding rapidly, the clay turning to liquid. Inside the house, the tension snapped. Caleb writes that the air pressure was so intense it made his ears pop. Caleb was keeping watch in the hallway. He saw the door to Julian's room open. The boy walked out. He was barefoot, wearing his nightshirt, moving with a calm, purposeful gait. He did not look like a sleepwalker. He looked like a soldier marching to orders. He walked past Caleb without acknowledging him. Caleb noted that Julian's eyes were wide open, the pupils dilated, fixed on something beyond the walls of the house. This is the moment of Caleb's decision. He could have stopped the boy. He could have woken Silas. He could have barred the door. But the Bible pages reveal his justification for inaction. "I carried the first one to the mud," Caleb wrote. "Now the mud calls the second one back. Who am I to stop God's accounting?" Caleb recognized that this was the inevitable conclusion of the cycle. To interfere would be to prolong the agony of the haunting. The twins needed to be together. The equation had to be balanced. Caleb decided to follow rather than intervene. He grabbed a lantern and his heavy coat. He shadowed Julian as the boy opened the heavy front door, which should have been too heavy for a 7-year-old to move. The wind howled, extinguishing the lantern immediately. Caleb followed by the flashes of lightning. He watched the small white figure of the boy walking steadily into the storm, his feet sinking into the mud, yet moving with unnatural speed. The decision to witness was an act of penance for Caleb. He had been the one to bury the brother. Now he would be the one to witness the reunion. He felt a strange sense of peace, a lifting of the burden. He writes that the house behind them, the Rowan mansion, seemed to scream as the wind tore through its eaves, as if the structure itself knew it was losing its air. Julian did not head for the road or the stables. He walked in a straight line toward the river, through the dense underbrush, tearing his skin on thorns, seemingly feeling no pain. He was heading for the Devil's Elbow. He knew the way. He had never been there in his waking life, but his brother had been calling from that spot for 7 years. Caleb's justification is rooted in a deep spiritual fatalism. He believed that the dark twin had a right to his brother. The separation was the sin. The reunion, however tragic, was the correction. "The clay is hungry," Caleb wrote. "It has waited long enough." He followed the boy into the dark, serving as the silent historian of the final act. The final entry in the Bible pages is written with a shaky hand, the charcoal smudged by rain and tears. It describes the scene at the riverbank. The Devil's Elbow had changed. The bank had collapsed, creating a slurry of mud and water that churned violently. The water level was high, licking at the roots of the trees. Julian stopped at the edge of the precipice, looking down into the swirling dark. Caleb writes that the lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark, strobe-like clarity. In the mud below, partially exposed by the erosion, was the cypress box. It had not rotted away. The anaerobic clay had preserved it. The lid was skewed, warped by the pressure, or perhaps pushed from the inside. Julian did not scream. He did not recoil. He knelt in the mud, his white nightshirt soaking up the red stain of the earth. He reached out his hands toward the box. Caleb watched from 10 feet away, paralyzed by the sanctity of the moment. Then the impossible happened. Caleb swears in his testimony that for a split second, before the bank gave way, he saw movement in the mud. He saw a small, dark hand reach up from the box, or the mud surrounding it, to grasp Julian's pale hand. "They touched," Caleb wrote, and the crying stopped. The sound of the wind seemed to drop. The world went silent for a heartbeat. Then The ground beneath Julian sheared off. The riverbank collapsed completely. Tons of wet clay, the cypress box, and the surviving twins slid silently into the churning waters of the Yazoo River. There was no splash, only the wet, sucking sound of the earth closing its throat. Julian did not struggle. He did not cry for help. He went into the dark willingly, embraced by the earth that held his brother. Caleb stood on the remaining ledge, shining his relit lantern into the water. There was nothing. No body surfaced. The clay had taken them both. The twins were finally reunited in the darkness of the riverbed, buried together as they had been born together. Caleb's interpretation of this event is not one of tragedy, but of completion. He is not lost, the final page reads. He is home. They are whole now. The horror of the live burial was resolved by the sacrifice of the survivor. The crime was expiated. The proof of betrayal and the air of pride were now indistinguishable in the democracy of the mud. This document serves as the only record of Julian's fate. To the rest of the world, he was a child lost to a flood, a tragic accident. But through Caleb's eyes, we see it as a supernatural imperative. The earth reclaimed what had been stolen from it. The final image Caleb leaves us with is not of death, but of a handshake, a dark hand and a light hand, clasped in the lightning, defying the world that tried to separate them. The aftermath of that night was swift and brutal, a cascade of destruction that wiped the Rowan family from the map. When Caleb returned to the house, alone, he found the doors swinging in the wind. He did not raise the alarm. He waited until dawn to report that the young master was missing. The search parties found nothing. The river was dragged, but the Devil's Elbow was too deep, the currents too treacherous. Julian Rowan was declared dead by drowning. Silas Rowan did not survive the loss of his legacy. The man who had obsessed over his bloodline now had nothing. 3 months after the storm, in February 1860, Silas walked into the main barn, climbed a ladder, and hanged himself with a horse bridle. He left no note. His death was the final admission of his failure to control his world. The patriarch who ruled by fear died in solitary silence. Annabeth's end was slower and more horrific. She was released from her locked room after Silas's death, but she refused to leave the nursery. She stopped eating. She sat in the rocking chair, staring at the empty corner where the crib had been. Servants reported that she would talk to the air, having conversations with 2 children. She died of starvation in the spring of 1860, wasted away to a skeleton, waiting for sons who would never return. Caleb remained at the plantation until Annabeth died. He was the one who closed her eyes. Before he fled north to freedom, sensing the coming civil war, he performed one last ritual. He went to the riverbank, gathered a bucket of the dense Yazoo clay, and mixed it with water. On the porch of the rotting main house, he used the clay to fashion a small, crude cross. It dried hard as stone. It was a marker for the grave that had no location. He hid the Bible with his charcoal pages behind the fireplace bricks, sealing his testimony into the foundation of the house. He knew that one day the house would fall, and the truth would need to be known. He disappeared into history, a man who had carried the burden of the buried crime and survived to tell it. The Rowan plantation fell into ruin. No heir claimed it. The land was considered cursed. It was reclaimed by the swamp. The house stood for decades, rotting, avoided by locals who claimed to hear the sound of children crying or laughing from the riverbank. The Yazoo malaise became a legend, a story told to frighten children away from the water, but the documents remained, waiting for the wrecking ball of 1928 to shatter the silence. Today, the site of the Rowan plantation is a dense thicket of scrub oak and kudzu. The river has shifted course over the last century, moving away from the old Devil's Elbow, leaving behind a scar of dried, cracked earth. There is no marker, no sign that a grand house once stood there. The only physical evidence that remains of the tragedy is the water-damaged Bible and the charcoal pages, now preserved in the archives of the Mississippi Historical Society. The story of the twins in the clay challenges our understanding of justice. It suggests that there are crimes so profound that the natural world rises up to address them when human law fails. Annabeth Rowan tried to bury her secret, but the earth refused to keep it. Silas Rowan tried to ignore the truth, but it destroyed his lineage. Julian Rowan became the bridge between the sins of the parents and the judgment of the soil. Historians and geologists have examined the site. No skeletons were ever recovered. The chemistry of the Yazoo clay is such that it can preserve bone for centuries or crush it to powder in years, depending on the pH and moisture. We will never know if the twins are still there, encased in the mud, holding hands in the dark. But local fishermen still avoid that bend in the old riverbed. They say the catfish there are black as night and taste of rot. They say that when the barometric pressure drops, you can hear a sound coming from the bank, not crying, but scratching. The sound of small hands digging. The case remains a macabre mystery that science cannot fully explain. Was it a case of shared psychosis, a tragic series of coincidences, or was it, as Caleb wrote, a spiritual reckoning? The documents tell us what happened, but they cannot tell us why the bond between the twins was so strong that it defied death. Perhaps some connections are forged not in life, but in the trauma of separation. History is often written by the victors, but in Yazoo County, it was written by the witness. Caleb's testimony forces us to confront the buried truths of our past. It reminds us that what we try to hide in the dark will eventually find its way to the light, even if it has to dig its way out with bloody fingernails. The Rowan twins are gone, but the clay remembers. And if you listen closely to the silence of the delta, you might find that the scratching has never stopped. If this story made you feel the weight of the earth pressing down on you, you're already part of the Before the Story community. We dig up what history tries to bury. Click the subscribe button now. It's the only way to ensure these stories aren't lost again. Hit the notification bell. The next investigation is already underway, and you won't want to be left in the dark when we open the next file. And finally, share this video with someone who trusts the silence of the woods. Let's see if they hear the scratching too. Sleep well. The earth is heavy, but the truth is heavier.